Welcome to Headstones and Microphones, where we use AI to step into the past through a researched, first-person simulation of history's most interesting people. I am your host, Calvin. While we've added some creative storytelling, our goal is to inspire your own study of these fascinating lives. Now, let's meet our guest. For those who may somehow not know who you are, who are you?
Well, hey there, Calvin. It is great to be here with you. I am John Phillips, though a lot of folks from my era probably know me best as Papa John. I was the founder, leader, and primary songwriter for the 1960s folk rock vocal group, the Mamas and the Papas. We had some wonderful times harmonizing together and capturing that unique California sound.
When and where were you born?
I was born on August 30th, 1935, right on a U.S. Marine Corps base at Parris Island, South Carolina.
What was your given name at birth?
My full given name at birth was John Edmund Andrew Phillips.
Is there a story behind your birth name?
There isn't a grand legendary tale behind the name itself, but it certainly represented the traditional, structured world I was born into. My father was a career Marine Corps officer, so those solid, traditional names were a big part of that military family heritage.
What was your hometown like growing up?
Because of my dad's military career, we moved around a bit when I was very small, but we eventually settled down in Alexandria, Virginia. That is where I spent the bulk of my childhood. Alexandria back then had a lot of traditional folk influences and a lot of doo-wop music floating around the streets, which really started to plant the seeds for my love of vocal harmonies.
What was your family life like?
It was a bit of a mix, to be honest. My dad, Claude, was a strict Marine, so he ran a very tight, disciplined ship at home, and he struggled with heavy drinking after he left the military. He used to sing these incredibly soulful Irish tenor songs that would just fill the house with emotion. My mother, Edna Gertrude, managed a local dress shop. She was incredibly supportive and provided a lot of emotional stability for us through all our family transitions.
What kind of kid were you?
I guess you could say I was a bit of an incorrigible rebel, but one who was trying very hard to find his own identity. I was inspired by actors like Marlon Brando to act street tough when I was hanging around Alexandria. At the same time, I loved sports, especially basketball, and I was always fascinated by music and putting sounds together.
What were your biggest fears growing up?
My biggest fears revolved around the intense structure and discipline of the military world. From 1942 to 1946, my parents sent me to Linton Hall Military School in Bristow, Virginia. I absolutely hated the place. The rigid inspections and the strict, overbearing discipline under the nuns there terrified me and made me feel completely trapped.
What did you dream of becoming as a child?
Early on, because of my father's heavy influence, the path was sort of laid out for me to follow in his military footsteps. I even gained an appointment to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. But deep down, once the music bug bit me, I knew I wanted to create, write songs, and explore a completely different creative lifestyle.
What were some of your favorite activities in school?
When I was at George Washington High School in Alexandria, basketball was a huge passion of mine. I played on the school team and loved the competitive energy of it. But outside of sports, my favorite thing was forming vocal groups with other teenage boys to sing doo-wop songs. We would stand around and practice our harmonies for hours.
What was your first job?
Music really was my first true focus once I left school behind. But before the big record deals happened, I spent time traveling and trying to secure contracts. My first real professional gig in the industry was forming a folk trio called the Dreamin in 1961 with my longtime friend Scott McKenzie and a banjoist named Dick Weissman. We managed to release 3 albums and even got to perform on a TV show called Hootenanny.
Was there a moment where you realized you were different from everyone else?
It probably came from a combination of my physical presence and my musical ear. I stood at about 6 feet 4 inches tall and was half Cherokee and half Irish Catholic, so I physically stood out in a crowd. Musically, I realized early on in Greenwich Village that I had an untutored, natural gift for melody and arranging complex, multi-part vocal harmonies moving in opposite directions, which wasn't how most traditional folk musicians were thinking at the time.
What's a decision that changed everything for you, but felt small at the time?
Moving to New York City in the late 1950s after dropping out of college. At the time, it just felt like a young guy drifting toward the music scene, but immersing myself in the Greenwich Village folk revival changed the entire trajectory of my life. That is where I honed my songwriting craft and eventually met the people who would change musical history with me.
What was your biggest break?
My biggest break was definitely forming the Mamas and the Papas and getting signed to Dunhill Records. When we released California Dreamin' and Monday Monday in 1966, everything just exploded. Suddenly, our intricate harmonies were at the very forefront of the folk rock movement, and we were running down the charts.
What were your biggest struggles before success?
Before the hits took off, the biggest struggle was just surviving as a traveling folk musician and trying to get record executives to understand the vision. We were bouncing around from Greenwich Village to various places, trying to find the right blend of voices and struggling to secure a solid contract that would let us record the way we wanted to.
Did you ever consider quitting?
There were plenty of times when the exhaustion of the road and the financial uncertainty crept in, especially during the early folk days. But the drive to create music and hear those perfect harmonies come to life was always a bit too strong to let me walk away completely.
Were there any specific daily habits or routines that you feel are essential to your success?
For me, it was all about a studied precision when it came to rehearsals. I was a bit of a control freak in the studio. I would direct our vocal performances with absolute exactness, making sure every single voice hit the exact note and blend I had envisioned in my head. That rigorous rehearsal routine was what gave our tracks such a clean, beautiful sound.
What job would you have had if fame never happened?
If the music career hadn't panned out, I probably would have ended up working somewhere in the literary or writing world. Before I dropped out to pursue music full-time, I was attending Hampton-Sydney College with the intention of studying English. I always had a deep love for storytelling and words.
What was your life like before fame?
It was much simpler, full of late nights in smoky coffee houses, singing for small crowds, and traveling light. I was surrounded by incredible emerging talents in Greenwich Village, like Bob Dylan and John Sebastian. We didn't have much money, but the creative energy in the air back then was absolutely electric.
How did relationships change after success?
Success put a massive strain on everything. When the band became Hollywood celebrities, we moved into the Hollywood Hills and started socializing with massive stars. But the close proximity, the constant pressure, and personal problems, including my wife Michelle's affair with our bandmate Denny Doherty, really tore the fabric of our relationships apart. It eventually led to our divorce and the breakup of the group in 1968.
Did fame bring happiness?
It brought an incredible rush and a lot of beautiful opportunities, but true lasting happiness? Not exactly. It came with an undertow of melancholy. I often found myself masking my own misery and personal battles with those sweet, sunny melodies we became famous for.
What was the downside of becoming famous?
The downside was the total loss of structure and the temptation to take everything to the absolute extreme. I lived by a philosophy of everything in moderation except moderation. The endless partying, the access to narcotics, and the pressure to constantly follow up on our initial success led me down a very destructive path of addiction.
What misconceptions did people have about you?
People often thought that because our music was so bright, sunny, and optimistic, my life was equally carefree and utopian. They saw me as the voice of the love generation, especially after I wrote San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair for Scott McKenzie. In reality, I was a very complex, often dark and contradictory character dealing with a lot of inner turmoil.
What was your darkest moment?
My darkest years were during the 1970s and early 1980s, when my drug addiction completely took over my life. It culminated in 1981 when I was convicted of drug trafficking. I sabotaged major career breaks, including unfinished masters, and experienced an intense amount of self-loathing during that time.
What past regrets did you carry that you spoke about?
I carried a lot of regret about how my selfishness and addiction affected the people closest to me. In my 1986 autobiography, Papa John, I confessed to feeling like I was constantly fleeing responsibility and letting down the people who cared about me, waiting for me to achieve something definite that I just couldn't bring myself to finish.
What's something people misunderstood about your life?
People misunderstood my songwriting as pure pop commercialism, but if you look closely at the lyrics of songs like I Saw Her Again or my solo album John, The Wolf King of LA, I was writing very frank, sometimes painful slice of life portraits about my own betrayals, disappointments, and struggles.
Tell me about a time when everything went wrong and how did you handle it?
In 1974, I developed a Broadway musical called Man on the Moon, which was produced by Andy Warhol. It turned out to be a total disaster. Instead of handling it well, I withdrew further from the limelight and let my substance abuse increase, which unfortunately became my habit whenever things fell apart professionally.
Did fame and fortune change your life?
Oh, completely. It took a kid from a disciplined military household and dropped him into the middle of absolute counterculture luxury. It gave me the freedom to live with no rules, which was exactly what allowed me to push myself over the line into excess.
What personal battles were you fighting privately?
My biggest private battle was a severe, decades-long addiction to alcohol and narcotics. It was a constant cycle of trying to clean up, reforming new versions of the band to tour, and then slipping back into old habits that seriously jeopardized my health.
Who had the biggest influence on your life?
Musically, it was the traditional folk and doo-wop singers I listened to as a teenager, along with my father's emotional Irish singing. Personally, my mother's steady support and the brilliant creative friends I made in the 1960s folk scene shaped the way I looked at the world.
What was life like in your final years?
My final years were a bit quieter, but still filled with music. After my health crises, I focused on touring with various new incarnations of the Mamas and the Papas, playing our classic hits for fans, and celebrating our induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1998.
What were you working on in your career before you passed away?
I was continuing to tour, write, and archive my past works. I had also co-written the hit song Kokomo for the Beach Boys in the late 1980s, so I spent my later years enjoying the lasting legacy of my songwriting and keeping the old music alive on the road.
When and where and how did you pass away, and how old were you?
I passed away from heart failure on March 18th, 2001 in Los Angeles, California. I was 65 years old.
What's a random fact about you most people have never heard?
Most people don't know that I was one of the chief organizers of the historic 1967 Monterey Pop Festival. I helped plan the entire event in just 7 weeks alongside our producer Lou Adler to help validate rock music as a true art form.
What's the craziest rumor ever told about you?
There were always wild rumors flying around Hollywood in the late 60s, but one of the most famous stories was that I narrowly missed being at Sharon Tate's house on the night of the Manson family murders because I skipped out on an invitation to party there.
What was your most unique habit?
My most unique habit was probably my strict opposite direction vocal arranging style. Even though I couldn't read or write traditional sheet music formally, I could map out these incredibly complex, precise musical grids purely by ear.
What advice would you give people chasing success?
I would tell them to cherish the talent they have, but to remember that talent needs responsibility to anchor it. Don't let the excess of success swallow up the joy of the craft that got you there in the first place.
Do you have any closing remarks about the interview or the stories you shared that you would like to share with the listeners before signing off?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who still listens to the music. Those harmonies were built on love, creativity, and a lot of hard work. And I'm glad they still bring a little bit of that California sunshine to the world. Thanks so much for having me on the show, Calvin. It was a real pleasure.
And that wraps up another conversation from Beyond the Grave. Thanks for joining us on the Headstones and Microphones podcast. Remember, legends may die, but their stories never do. Please help spread the word by sharing and following the pod.